Um, okay, so this touches upon something that we discussed in the summer. We did a series on the Shema, and one of the things we talked about is testimony. And that's related to this week's parsha, because this week's parsha is the laws, not the only place, but one of the places where the Torah emphasizes that in matters of judgment, because we're talking about the shoftim v'shotrim, to appoint judges and officers, and then the Supreme Court, etc. So it talks about their witnesses and testimony, and the importance of testimony, and that you need two witnesses to establish a matter. And then when you start thinking about witnesses and testimony in Jewish law, the commentaries come upon two different categories of witnesses, and they analyze the difference between these two categories, and that will also come to the spiritual equivalent of those two categories. So, like I said, we're going to cover different areas of Jewish law and of Torah, and it all starts from, doesn't start, but one way to come into this is the idea that it's based on the verse in Isaiah where the prophet tells the people in the name of God, Atem Edai, you are my witnesses. In other words, you're the witnesses in this world. The Jewish people are the witnesses in this world to testify about the existence of God and testify about the will of God, etc. Now, there's a beautiful commentary that says that if you look at the sentence, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So if you look at the Torah, the word Shema in the Torah has a large letter, ayin. Because the Torah, most of the letters are the same, but there are few letters have to be small, and a few letters have to be large, the font size. And if you miss that, the Torah is disqualified. In other words, it's critical. The letters, the small letters, the large letters, they're critical. So the point here is that Shema, the word Shema, has a large ayin. The word echad, God is one, so the word here has a large ayin. The word echad, the word one, has a large dalid. And there are various interpretations of why each one is large, but there's one interpretation that combines the both and says, when you say Shema, when you declare the oneness of Hashem, in essence, you are an ayin and a dalid. Ayin and dalid spell aid, spell witness. So the idea of saying Shema is the idea of testifying to the oneness of Hashem. Okay, so before we figure out what does that mean, and what does it mean to testify, and why do you have to use that terminology? It could be you could be telling the story. What's the idea of testimony? So before we get to that, we're going to start with the legal different categories of witnesses, and maybe some of the ramifications between them, and then we'll move to the spiritual. So I'll say it by heart a little bit, and then we can also read some of this in translation in English, which is probably a plus. Okay, so if I ask you, what do witnesses do, and why do you have witnesses? Like, why do we need witnesses? So the conventional interpretation, and this is true, in other words, in many areas, that witnesses don't really accomplish anything. Witnesses are not here to accomplish anything. The witnesses are here to make sure that which has been accomplished is respected. In other words, if I come to you and I say, could you lend me $50? And you lend me $50, I owe you the $50 regardless if we have witnesses, regardless if there's a document, regardless if I deny it or I don't deny it, or you can collect it or you don't collect it. The transaction where you gave me the $50 now makes me indebted to you for $50. Why do we have witnesses? In case I deny it. But even if I don't deny it, I still owe you the money. So if there are no witnesses, I still owe you the money. In a way, what the Talmud says, lo ivru sahadi ela l'shakri, which is Aramaic for witnesses were only created for the liars. In other words, the witnesses don't really do anything. The underlying transaction is binding, and the witnesses are just here to testify in case somebody denies. Go ahead, Bob, please.
And just an added point, to underscore the unreliability of witnesses, you need two witnesses.
You need two witnesses, yeah.
So one witness is not even any good.
For sure. One witness is off the table. One witness is totally off the table. There's nothing to talk about. When we say witnesses in the Torah, it's two witnesses. Because one witness, what are you going to do? How are you going to figure out if the guy's saying the truth, if he remembers, if he doesn't remember? If you have two witnesses, you could begin to string something together. You could interrogate each one separately. You could combine, make sure the story is consistent. You have at least some semi-scientific way of determining. In other words, it's harder to lie with two witnesses. Put it that way. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's much harder. But one witness, yeah. But again, what do I need witnesses for? I need witnesses just to tell me, to make sure that nobody denies the underlying transaction. The underlying transaction is perfect without any witnesses. And that's usually what we mean when we say witnesses. And in the Talmudic parlance, you would say Edei Birur. These are witnesses who clarify. They don't achieve anything. They clarify. So if I come to court, if you pull me to court and you say, I owe Menachem $50 and I deny it, and the witnesses come and say, I owe you $50, the witnesses are not the cause of why I owe you the money. I owe you the money because of the transaction. The witnesses are just clarifying. Okay, that's one category. But then in Judaism, there's a very interesting separate category of witnesses. And that's what we call Edei Kiyum. These are witnesses that actually establish the matter. Without witnesses, nothing happens. In other words, the witnesses here are not here to testify about this transaction in case someone denies, but the witnesses give this transaction the legal validity. So we're going to call it Edei Kiyum, witnesses who establish. And by the way, that's in the Torah, when it's in this week's Parsha, it says, Api shnaim edim yakum davar. Based on two witnesses, the matter will be established. So using that term established is probably broadening the conversation to include also the second category of witnesses. What is the best example for witnesses who establish? Best example would be witnesses for a marriage, right? So on the chuppah, the most important ingredient, other than the bride and the groom, people think maybe it's the rabbi. It is not. You don't need a rabbi to get married. I hope the rabbis don't get upset that I say that. What you do need is you need two witnesses. And if you have a wedding, a chuppah, without two witnesses, the kiddushin, the betrothal, does not take effect. And by the way, it's not so simple, because if you have a wedding with 10 people, a small wedding on an island, it's not so easy to find two witnesses, because you have to find two strangers. Because under the laws of witnesses, a relative cannot be a witness. So if everybody at the wedding is your cousin or your brother, then you run into problems. So sometimes it's not so easy to find witnesses. But the point is, a kosher wedding has to have two witnesses. Now, these two witnesses are not here in case the groom denies the marriage, in case the bride says, sorry, I never wanted to marry this guy. It never happened. It was all a lie. That's not why you have witnesses. The witnesses are here, even if both bride and groom agree, and they said, look, I was here, it was at this resort, and I gave this woman a ring, and I said, you're betrothed to me. Doesn't matter. If there weren't kosher witnesses, the matter did not have to take effect. Okay? So this is a totally separate category. This is a category, not witnesses who are testifying to something that happened. In other words, they're not clarifying. They're not saying something objectively happened and we're here just as bystanders to tell you in case someone chooses to deny it, meaning we're clarifying what happened. That's category one of witnesses. Category number two of witnesses is that, no, the witnesses make it happen. Without the witnesses, it would not have happened. And there are all kinds of ramifications between these two types of witnesses. If you have a minute or two, we'll get into it. But it's important to understand these two categories, because in every matter of law, when you talk about witnesses, this is the question: are these witnesses establishing, or are these witnesses just clarifying? Or the order we said first clarifying, then establishing, and then we can, like I said, I'll try to give a little ramification here, and then we can talk about the spiritual matters, because there's also different ways of testifying to the oneness of Hashem. And this goes on and on and on. Very long essay. I doubt we'll finish most of it, but at least we'll start. We'll get our palates wet. So that's good. Okay, so let's give a ramification of how come. What's the difference? What do you see in the law? There's a difference between these two categories of witnesses. So I know you may have came for a spiritual and Kabbalah and inspiration, and you're going to say, why is the rabbi talking about law? But that's the way the Torah is. Everything is intertwined, especially Hasidism, especially the Rebbe's teachings. It's always trying to show that the legal part of Torah and the spiritual part of Torah are not two separate ideas. They're body and soul, and therefore they reflect each other. and the nuances of the learning, the revealed part of Torah, the legal part of Torah, is relevant to the spiritual side of Torah as well. Okay, so this is just an example of how we think about these categories of law definitions of witnesses and how it informs questions that come up when we read the Talmud. So just here's an example. The example is that the law is that anytime there are witnesses, the witnesses must be interrogated. Like Bob said, one witness is a waste of time. Two witnesses, you can separate them, you can interrogate them and say what happened, when did it happen, ask the details. And in this week's parsha, is it this week's parsha? I believe it's in this week's parsha. V'darshu hashoftim, the judges will inquire and they'll ask, and it's called Derisha v'chakira, which is inquiring and investigating. And the Mishnah and the Tractate Sanhedrin has a whole bunch of questions, a list of questions that you have to ask. There are 7 questions that every witness has to ask. And if you don't answer these 7 questions, you are not a witness. And then there's many other questions you could ask, right? I don't want to get political, but sometimes there was this, I don't want to say names here because I don't want to make this about politics, but sometimes there was this guy, I won't say the name, but you know what I'm talking about. There was this guy appointed to the Supreme Court, and there was accusations that he did something wrong. And I'm sitting and listening to it, and I have no opinion of whether he should have been on the Supreme Court or not. It's not important. I don't want to get into that specific case. But the point here is, whoops. Resume recording. Okay. The point is, the person says, well, the guy did something wrong. When? I don't know. What year? I don't know. What day? I don't know. What month? I don't know. So in Talmudic law, that's not an accusation. That's not testimony. Because I can't defend myself. How am I going to defend myself? You tell me at some point I robbed the bank. How am I going to defend that? How can I prove a negative? If you tell me on Monday afternoon at 2 p.m. you robbed the bank, then I can defend myself, right? So that's what we call Derisha v'chakira, the investigations. The problem is, I'll take Vicky's question in a second. The problem is that for sometimes we say, if there's no investigation, there's no testimony. Other matters we say, yeah, you don't have to investigate. If you're a witness at a wedding, you don't have to investigate. How come? Why the difference? Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for presenting those two ideas of two kind of witnesses. And for the idea of the witness, the second category, the one that only establishing, is very interesting. I was just wondering how it corresponds to the idea of observer, because until the observer sees that the event actually doesn't even happen. So
right.
The philosophical sense.
Yeah, so that's philosophically connected to the idea that you must have an observer, even though it's not perfect, because in the case of the marriage, there are observers. There's the bride, there's the groom, there's the bride's mother, there's other people, but as far as the witnesses are concerned, if there's no objective observer, it did not take place. Not that it didn't take place. Maybe everyone came and everyone ate the food and everyone ate the dessert and ate the wedding cake. But the legality of the event, in other words, this mystical, spiritual, I don't want to say mystical, but this what's the word I'm looking for? Intangible bond between bride and groom, which is a spiritual matter, did not occur if there were no witnesses, because the witnesses are not here, not serving just to clarify what happened. That's witnesses, for example, for monetary issues or even criminal cases. The witnesses don't make the guy liable. If I killed my friend, I'm liable. I'm liable for capital punishment, not because the witnesses saw me. That's independent. But then there are matters, and the question is, and then there are matters, like you say, the observer is the one who creates it.
But the question was, how does it correspond to observer in the sense of philosophy and quantum physics? Because everything, unless we see, I mean, you cannot even establish the fact in any matter. It's not only
right. So I think that there are observers. In other words, there is a concept of there are observers. The question is, do we need the witness to be the observer? Do we need the impartial party to be the observer? Right? So if I borrow $50 from you, it happened in the real world and there's an observer. And that's why it's legal and that's why it's binding. The point when it comes to a wedding, for the purpose of the spiritual concept of the spiritual covenant, of the covenant of marriage, there we need a specific type of observer. And if that observer was not present, then the matter didn't happen. Other matters happened. Everybody came and had a good time, and the photographer was there. And not only whether it's the observer, but it was live streamed on YouTube. But it doesn't matter. In other words, for the purpose of our discussion, for what needs to be done here, in other words, when it comes to the marriage, is a specific type of observer necessary. So I don't know that that's the philosophy that gets into that. That's more mysticism and metaphysics. But the point is that there is a correlation, as you bring up. There's a correlation between it didn't happen if the witness didn't see it.
And that's not only for the particular event, for anything. Like
right. But for the other matters, we don't need the witness to be the observer. The creditor and the borrower, they're the observers.
Yeah.
We could be in a closed room and I borrow money from you. Fine, I owe you the money. The transaction, right? It's a real objective thing that happened, and it was observed by people, not by impartial people, not by witnesses. Okay, but we don't really need witnesses to establish it. We need witnesses in case somebody denies it. So in this case, if I deny it, you can't prove it in court. The event still happened. The event was still observed. But when it comes to more of a metaphysical concept, like a covenant, like a spiritual bond, here, to create that spiritual bond, for whatever reason, the Torah says you need witnesses to observe, and if there's no observer, there's no deal. I mean, it's a wonderful wedding. The food was good, the caterer got paid, everybody's happy, but the legal bond is not there. Go ahead, Dr. Baum, please.
So much of what we talk about here is the tension between the spiritual and the earthly.
Yes.
Are we to assume, without the Ayin and the Dalet and Shema, which is the most spiritual of all our principles, if we can't find witnesses, that the basic tenet of Judaism, the Shema, is really
very good. Very good. That's exactly where we're headed. And
okay.
we're going to get into this, the idea that there are different levels of testimony of Hashem. And the world itself testifies to the greatness of Hashem. Creation itself tells the story of God. We say it in davening. It's in Psalm 19. We'll say it tomorrow morning. Hashemayim misaprim kavod el. The heavens declare the glory of Hashem. And we say it in the end of the Parsh, in the end of the Torah, Ha'azinu. We're going to read it in a few weeks, where Moshe makes the heaven and the earth, where also Vayelach and Ha'azinu. Moshe makes the heaven and the earth witnesses to testify to what's happening. So in other words, there is testimony that you don't need human involvement. The creation itself testifies to the greatness of Hashem. Nevertheless, what we're trying to establish here is that there are different categories of testimony, and the Jewish person saying the Shema reaches a deeper level of testimony, testifies to a deeper truth, and reveals more of Hashem's presence than the universe does on its own. So the short answer is, yes, of course there's witnesses. Hashem's greatness will be testified without the Jew, but the Jew obviously, so Shema is true regardless if we say it or not. But when we say it, we're revealing a deeper truth than that which is the naked eye could understand, or even the philosopher could understand. So that's exactly where we're going. And I'll be honest with you that we're talking about an essay that has, how many? That has 14 sections or 14 chapters or short chapters, call it what you want. We're going to get into maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, but it goes deeper and deeper because we're getting into the more nuanced idea of what exactly does the Jew achieve through saying Shema. But obviously Shema is just, in a way, just not a metaphor, but Shema represents the Jews' service of Hashem, right? So there is godliness in the world. There is God's presence in the world. You could discover it, but when the Jew says Shema, and generally when the Jew serves Hashem, we're getting deeper. We're getting into deeper concepts of holiness, deeper layers of holiness, which we're going to begin to discuss. So don't go anywhere, even though we spent 25 minutes on the revealed part of Torah. So let me just tie up one little point here. How come when it comes to monetary witnesses, the Torah says there must be investigation? When it comes to criminal testimony, there must be investigation. When it comes to a wedding, the witnesses of the wedding don't have to be investigated, and it's still considered testimony. So one theory is as follows. This is a theory put forth by the Rogatchover, which was a 20th century sage, and he passed away in the 1930s, and the Rebbe really liked the way he learned, and the Rebbe said about himself that he likes his style. So what the Rogatchover, he comes from a town called Rogatchov. That's why his name is the Rogatchover. Yosef Rosen was his name. And his thing is like this. His thing is, the witnesses who clarify. I borrowed money from Vicky. I borrowed $50 from Vicky. Okay, the witnesses clarify. witnesses were present in that room 5 years ago when she gave me $50. Okay. When do they become witnesses? At the moment of the transaction? No, at the moment of the transaction, they didn't really do anything. They weren't necessary. They weren't really necessary. They didn't play any role in what's happening. They're just observers, but they didn't really play a role. When do they play a role? When they come to court to testify. So they come to court and they say, we want to be witnesses. For what? Something that happened 5 years ago. Oh, you want to be witnesses? Something happened 5 years ago? So you want to become a witness now? So now we're going to investigate you to find out when did it happen. But in other words, because you want to, when you come to court, in other words, you're becoming a witness when you enter the court. So the court has to testify, has to interrogate you to make sure you're a valid witness. But if you look at the second category, where you got married in an island in the Caribbean, and you had two witnesses there, when did those witnesses become witnesses? Not in court. They became witnesses under the chuppah. So they're already witnesses. So when they come to court, they don't have to do anything to establish their credentials because they're not becoming witnesses in the court. So in other words, when the Torah says when Torah says two strangers walk into the court and they want to testify, you have to investigate them. That's because they want to establish themselves as witnesses right now. Because clarifying witnesses become witnesses when they come into court. But witnesses who become witnesses by virtue of being there and observing, and without them there would be no marriage 5 years ago, they became witnesses 5 years ago. They didn't become witnesses now. So when they come to court, they're already perfect witnesses. Okay, that's a little philosophical. Let's open the English and let's get to the spiritual, and we'll get to we'll overlap with Bob's question. So even before we get to, so the first point we're going to say is as follows. The first point we're going to say is that there are certain matters that you don't need witnesses for. You don't need to testify. The Gemara says that matters that are Davida Liglui, it's likely it's going to surface on its own. You don't need witnesses for. Let me give you an example. The example is, okay, I don't want this example will be a little complicated. Okay, the example is somebody comes and says, there's a woman, we think she's married, her husband died. Could the woman remarry? So usually you need two witnesses. The rabbis say, here, one witness is enough. How can it be one witness? This is a serious matter. Women who are married are going to marry somebody else. This is going to be a big deal. This is potentially a big sin, a big deal. There could be ramifications for the next generation, terrible things. So the different interpretations of why the rabbis allow it is aguna. They don't want the woman to be stuck in marriage. They want to be lenient. But one interpretation is you don't really need witnesses that this guy died, because this is something that is going to surface. If the person was alive, he's going to show up, right? So in other words, there are matters that are likely that happened that we're going to find out about without the witnesses. We don't really need witnesses. When we need witnesses about something that happened in the past, and there's no way to show up, there's no way to find out. Did I borrow $50 or yes or no? There's no way to know. So in other words, there's a certain level of awareness that you don't need a witness for. It's obvious. So something that's obvious, you don't need witnesses. And then there's the deeper level, which is the level of something that is concealed, a matter that's concealed, and therefore you need witnesses. Okay, going to Bob's question. Do we need witnesses that Hashem exists? The answer is no, it's obvious. Anyone who's objective and could see the complexity of the creation understands that every cause has every effect has a cause. Everything has a source. Nothing in the world could just exist without a source. Everything has to have a source. Hashem creates the world as a creator. That's why all the philosophers understood there's a creator. You don't need witnesses for that. That's obvious. And we just said that for something that's obvious, you don't need witness. So what do you need witness? You need witnesses, you need testimony to tell you something that is not obvious to the eye. And that is the deeper level of godliness, the fact that God is transcendent, the fact that God is infinite, the fact that the entire universe is insignificant compared to God, et cetera, et cetera. The true essence of God is not revealed, and for that we need witnesses. And that's going to be the first point we're going to analyze. And the second point that we're going to analyze is that, I'm just going to give it briefly, that's a spoiler alert, so if you have to end here, we could, you already have the full thing, but we're going to analyze it. But the first point is, the universe itself talks about that there's a creator. You don't need testimony for that. The testimony is revealing and teaching about higher levels of godliness, higher levels of awareness of godliness. That's number one. Number two is when the universe testifies about God, they are clarifying. In other words, you may have not known that God exists. The universe tells you God exists. The Jewish people, they're the second category of witnesses. They establish the matter, like the witnesses at the wedding, which make the event happen. What does that mean? We make the event happen? There's a certain level of godliness that is not in the world. When we testify, because it's too great, it's too transcendent, it's too infinite. When we testify about the true existence of God, we are bringing that level of godliness into the world. So we're not just functioning as an observer, but we are a player. We're making the thing happen. We are drawing the true essence of God into this world. So we're doing two things that the universe itself doesn't do. Number one, we're testifying about the greater levels of godliness, the transcendent level of godliness. And number two, we're not just saying that something exists, but we, through our service, are actually making it happen. In that sense, we're not like the first category of witnesses, the clarifying witnesses. We are like the witnesses who establish the matter. So that is the story in a nutshell. There's a lot more detail, so I'm going to open up the English and we'll read it, and hopefully we'll be able to enjoy and internalize and understand that what we do every day when we say the Shema and every day when we serve God, we're not just testifying to something that already exists, but we're actually making real change within the cosmos, within the spiritual essence of the universe. Okay, let's see what's happening here. Selections. Okay. Okay, we're starting from section 4. Here we go. All concepts that exist within Nigla, the revealed and largely legalistic dimension of Torah study, reflect and parallel their inner spiritual dimensions. Thus, there are parallels within the inner dimensions of the Torah to all of the above-mentioned concepts applying to witnesses. So, in other words, what we discussed earlier, there's the reflect in the revealed part of Torah is reflected in the spiritual part of Torah. And now he's just summarizing what we have discussed. A, that there are two types of witnesses: Eidei Birur, witnesses who clarify, and Eidei Kiyum, witnesses who establish. B, that witnesses to Kiddushin are Eidei Kiyum, witnesses to betrothal, to marriage, are witnesses who establish. They're not just clarifying that something happened, but they make it happen. And number 3, that Eidei Kiyum are granted the status at the time they observe the act, while Eidei Birur attain their status while testifying in court. We discussed that. And D, that the strength and validity of an act brought about through Eidei Kiyum is greater than an act completed through the principles, actions alone. We didn't discuss that at length, so we're going to skip that for right now. Okay, so all this is reflected in the spiritual part of Torah. So let's see. The Zohar offers two interpretations of the verse. You are my witnesses, declares God. In other words, the verse, that's the verse I mentioned earlier, that Isaiah says, Atem Eidai. This is Isaiah 43, it says, Atem Eidai, you are my witnesses. The question is, who's the you? Who is Isaiah talking to? So the Zohar offers two interpretations. Number one, A, that it refers to the Jewish people, and B, that it refers to heaven and earth. As it is written, this day I call upon heaven and earth as witnesses to you. That's from the end of Deuteronomy, Moshe speaking in the portion of Vayelech, my bar mitzvah portion. So we're saying here that there's two categories of witnesses that testify to the existence of God: heaven and earth, and the Jewish people. And now what we're going to say is that heaven and earth and the Jewish people fall into these two categories of witnesses who establish and witnesses who clarify and witnesses who establish. How so? So let's see. As explained below, it can be said that these two types of witnesses, the Jewish people and heaven and earth, represent these two categories of witnesses: Eidei Birur, witnesses who clarify, and Eidei Kiyum, witnesses who establish, as we will discuss in number 5. Okay. bearing testimony to God's essence. So we're going to start. The Alter Rebbe. Where does the Alter Rebbe say this? Let's see. The Alter Rebbe, okay, so the Alter Rebbe explains at length that the testimony of witnesses is relevant only, quote, regarding matters that is concealed and hidden from public view. However, when something is evident and apparent to all, there is no need for witnesses. The concept of and necessity for testimony is not relevant because the matter is public knowledge. Furthermore, even when a matter is presently not apparent, but will eventually be revealed, that's the quote from the Talmud, Milsa da'avida ligluye, a quote from the Talmudic commentaries, it does not require the testimony of witnesses in a comprehensive sense when a witness is necessary, specifically regarding a matter that is entirely concealed. So that's what we mentioned earlier. Now we're going to get to the spiritual equivalent. In other words, when it comes to something that is obvious, you don't need witnesses. So Shema Yisrael, the existence of God, if it was so obvious, you don't need witnesses. But maybe it is obvious. Yeah. So let's see. If we need witnesses, that's because A, it's not obvious, and B, it's not even something that is avida ligluye, likely to become revealed. Witnesses are necessary when something is completely concealed. So now we're going to try to explain what this means in the spiritual level, in the spiritual sense. The spiritual counterpart to this concept can be explained as follows. There is no need for the testimony of witnesses regarding the fact that God endows all the worlds with life. To use the vernacular of the Zohar and Chassidus, the dimension of godliness that is memale kol almin, the dimension of godliness that fills the entire world, fills each creation. In other words, we have this discussion. I don't know if we have done it lately, but Chassidus is all over this. There's two. The basic concept of faith in God. So it's interesting that sometimes it says the mitzvah is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God. So sometimes it's classified as a mitzvah to believe. Maimonides himself says it's a mitzvah to believe. In his book of mitzvot, he says it's a mitzvah to believe. But in his book of Mishnah Torah, and also in the Zohar, and other Talmudic and other commentaries, even on the Maimonides, point out that the Zohar and the Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah don't say there's a mitzvah to believe. They say there's a mitzvah to know. And Chassidus talks about this. Is there a mitzvah to believe or not? And the point here is that in some sense, the basic notion of God, that there's a source that creates the universe, you don't need faith. You don't need faith for that because that's a logical concept. So the mitzvah is to know. Faith is only that which the mind cannot grasp, like the infinity of God, the fact that God transcends time and space. That's something that we cannot understand. It's beyond our capacity to picture. But the basic concept of God, you don't need faith. It's logical. And similarly, we're saying over here that the concept, if you're saying that we need testimony to the existence of Hashem, we're not talking about the idea, the basic idea that God creates the world and that God gives life to the world, or what Chassidus or the Zohar refer to, mimale kol almin, the limited ray of God that fills each creation. The fact that every creation exists is because there's a spark of godliness within it. That you don't need testimony. Why? Because creation itself tells the story. It's obvious, right? When a person contemplates the ordered pattern with which the world is guided, he perceives that there is divine vitality that endows the world with life. As stated in the verse, "For my flesh I perceive godliness." That's a verse from the book of Job. And there, what Job is saying is that just like I don't need faith that I have a soul, I see my body, and I see my body is alive, so I know I have a soul. So too the world is like the body, and if you see life in the world, it's because obviously the world has a soul, and the soul is God. As our sages comment, just as the soul fills the body, so too the Holy One, blessed be He, fills His world. This realization is obvious, a logical imperative, so clear that such belief in God also exists among righteous non-Jews, as it is well known. Accordingly, the testimony of witnesses is not necessary regarding it. You don't need witnesses to testify that God exists and God gives life to the creation. That's common. That's obvious to the mind's eye. What do you need faith, and what do you need witnesses' testimony for? So now we go to the next step. Even faith in the dimension of godliness that transcends the world, to use the vernacular of the Zohar and Chassidus, the dimension of godliness that is sovev kol almin. So in other words, according to the Zohar and Chassidus, you have the male kol almin, you have the limited light that creates the world. And then you have the transcendent light, literally that encompasses, that surrounds all the world. It's the infinite light. So even that, it's not revealed. You can't see it, obviously, but we're going to classify it as something that is likely to be revealed. In other words, if you logically, you could deduce from the universe that if God can create the world, he must also be transcendent. So it's not as obvious. So we're not going to classify it as something that is obvious, but we'll classify it as something that is likely to be revealed. So let's see how that would work. True, this level of godliness cannot be comprehended through the intellect, since intellect is bound by the limitations of the world. Nevertheless, logic itself recognizes and compels one to conclude that there exists divine light that transcends intellectual grasp. Could I understand that there's something that's greater than myself? Yeah, I could understand that. Well, I don't know what's greater than what I could understand. Could I understand that there could be possibly things that are outside my capacity to grasp? I don't understand what that is, but my logic could lead me to acknowledge that there are things outside of my capacity to understand. So maybe I don't understand them, but I understand that there could be something outside of my knowledge. So in other words, after logic has compelled the person to recognize the divine life force in the world, it leads him to the awareness that the fundamental dimension of godliness is not that it brings worlds into existence. And there are levels of godliness that transcend the limitations of the world and the scope of logic. So basically we're saying for testimony, you don't even need testimony to tell you about the transcendent aspect of godliness, because yes, true, the transcendent aspect of godliness is not revealed, but it's a matter that the mind could discover, because the mind could discover that there are things beyond its capacity to understand. So what do I need testimony for? And here's the big idea. Accordingly, the testimony of witnesses is also not relevant regarding the transcendent level. Although it is not a matter that is apparent, since it cannot be grasped through comprehension, it can nevertheless be considered a matter that will eventually be revealed, because even though it transcends intellect, its existence is a logical imperative. What is testimony then? When we say the Shema, what are we testifying about? And now we're going to say as follows. When is the testimony of witnesses relevant? Regarding God's essence, which transcends even the level of Sovev Kalam, the level that transcends transcendence, which is entirely beyond the reach of logic. Since his essence is a matter that is entirely hidden, the testimony of witnesses is relevant and necessary to reveal his essence, just as the testimony of witnesses in the simple sense brings out matters that are entirely hidden. So that's the first point we're going to try to say. And then we're going to get to the two categories within witnesses, and then maybe we'll conclude with that. But the first point, just to summarize, what did we say until now? We're saying like this. Bob's question. Do you need witnesses to testify that God exists? What happens if we would not say the Shema? Would people not know that God exists? What is the answer? The answer is, if it's obvious, you don't need witnesses. The fact that God creates the world is obvious. The fact that there's a limited light of God within the world that creates every existence is obvious. You don't need testimony. Obvious to the logical mind that's thinking objectively. What about the transcendence of God? That the entire, like we talked about in the Tanya in the second section, that the entire creation is like one ray compared to the light of the sun. So in other words, that God is infinitely removed from the sun from the creation, because God transcends all of creation. And that's a level that we cannot comprehend, because we don't understand what does it mean to transcend all of creation, including time and space. So yes, so that's Sovev Kalam, that's the light that encompasses the world. So that's not obvious. And that's why many, even people who believe in God, don't necessarily accept that. So it's not obvious. But the Rebbe says, according to the Alter Rebbe, even for that, you don't need witness, you don't need testimony. Because we have this category that not just something that is obvious do you not need testimony, but something that's likely to be revealed. Also, you do not need testimony. So this is likely to be revealed because the mind can understand that there are things beyond its capacity. So the mind can understand that there is a transcendent light. What the mind cannot understand, or is not forced by the mind cannot force you to that conclusion, is that there is the essence of God. The essence of God is not transcendent, it's not present, it's removed from both of those. It can be both transcendent and present, immanent and transcendent altogether. It defies every category, defies every definition. That is something that the mind itself will never lead to. So for that, you need testimony. For that, we have to say, Hashem Echad, God is one. What is God is one? The essence of God is one. And we talk about the essence of God. Now the question is, what are we doing? Are we just clarifying something that already exists? Are we the first category of witnesses, clarifying witnesses? Or are we witnesses that establish the existence of God, the existence of the essence of God within the world that we're about to get to? Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Quick question. That's a very, very deep idea, and I'm wondering, not probably everybody who says the Shema read this essay.
Right.
So that's my guess. So my question is, even if somebody who didn't read this essay and says Shema, does it still testify? Does it have to say?
It does. I think it does because so let's read with that. Yeah, I think he is. I think by so if he's it's funny. If he's just clarifying, maybe not. But we're going to say that when the Jew says Shema, he's making it happen. So if you're making it happen, you don't even have to understand it fully. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a witness for marriage, but I'm a single guy. I never got married. I really don't understand what marriage is, right? So can I testify? Can I give a lecture and tell people about marriage? No, I don't understand. But can I make the marriage happen? Yeah, if I'm a kosher witness, I can. Because sometimes if I'm establishing, if I'm making it happen, it doesn't really matter if I understand it or not. It's not really about the understanding. So if you say the Shema, we're going to get, if we were witnesses who clarify, maybe not, because to clarify, you have to get your story straight. If you don't know what you're clarifying, you're not clarifying anything. So that's an interesting point. I never thought about it. If you are clarifying witnesses, we have to understand fully what we're saying and exactly what we're doing and know our story and get our story straight, which sometimes is beyond the capacity. What do we know about spiritual matters? But if we're achieving something, we're hitting the button and making it happen, then I don't have to understand the technology. I'm not the engineer, but I'm hitting the button, I'm making it happen, and the button makes it happen. Okay, so let's get to the next step. We'll finish this section, and then we'll save the rest, God willing, in good health. Okay, let's read. Let's continue. Now we're going to say the revelation of God's essence. So that was the first thing we established. What are we trying to reveal? We're not trying to reveal the fact that God exists and that God creates the world and God has life and there's life, godly life within this world, keeping everything alive, keeping all the atoms spinning, keeping the trees alive, keeping everything happening. That's obvious. We're not trying to clarify that there's Sovev Kolam and that God transcends the world. Also obvious. The essence of God, which defies any description, that is not obvious. I'm sorry, that's not obvious. Second level is likely to be revealed because the mind could understand that there are things beyond this capacity to understand. So the mind could lead us to the idea that if this what we see, there's also the source of that, and that would be transcendence. The essence of God is completely concealed. But when we testify, we're testifying to the essence of God. So once we understand that, now there's two ways to clarify to testify to the essence of God. Here we go. The revelation of God's essence is brought about through the two types of witnesses mentioned above. Eidei Birur, which is clarifying witnesses. Now we're going to say God implants in creation witnesses, i.e. heaven and earth, that demonstrate and reveal the infinite power that he invested in existence. As is well known, the hosts of heaven exist for all time, the existence of each entity being eternal. And also every species of the hosts of the earth is timeless. In this way, heaven and earth serve as a debirur, pointing to the existence of God's essence, since we can appreciate that their eternality is possible only because of God's infinite power, which transcends all limitations of time. This is very interesting. The philosophical idea is like this. Every creation is limited. Every creation is mortal. Every creation is going to end. Only God is infinite. Now, within the universe, there are certain, nothing is truly infinite, but there are certain, what's the way of putting it? There's a certain expressions of infinity that exist within the world. For example, in the heavens, we look at the sun is the same every day. I know the scientists say we're going to run out of fuel in 5 billion years. That's a separate discussion. Relative to the lifespan of Earth, the lifespan of a person on Earth, the sun has an array of infinity. But even species on Earth, while an individual person is mortal, humanity as a whole is immortal because even each person is immortal, potentially because each person has the potential to give birth to a child, which in turn has the potential to give birth to a child, which in turn theoretically can go on forever and ever, right? So there is that capacity that you could have a child that will now exist forever because they're through their children, and it all comes from you. So that's an array of infinity. So the question is, where does a ray of infinity come into the world? It comes from the essence of God, because only the essence of God is infinite. So in other words, if you look around the world with a magnifying glass, you will find things that testify to the infinity of God, to the essence of God. What? Heaven and earth. But heaven and earth are not doing anything. They're just clarifying that what God did. God planted them in the earth. But now this becomes much more complicated. The Jewish people, we are establishing witnesses. Let's see. Eidei Kiyum. There are also witnesses who were endowed with the potential to draw down, as it were, God's essence into the world in a manner resembling that in which Eidei Kiyum bring about the halachic significance of an action and make it an act of consequence. This refers to the Jewish people, whose souls are rooted in God's essence, and who therefore possess the power through the divine service of Torah and mitzvot to draw down God's essence into the world. A Jew, because his source is in the essence of God, and because he's commanded to do the mitzvot, and the mitzvot are also rooted in the essence of God. So when we do a mitzvah, we're not testifying to something that already happened, but we are bringing and drawing the essence of God into the universe. And now there's a beautiful, beautiful, poetic, romantic paragraph in parentheses. In the Hebrew, it's in the parentheses. And we're going to say, that's why the prime, and here you see, this is so beautiful and so poetic. I wish I was a poet. That's why the prime example of witnesses who establish, the prime example is marriage. Because what we're doing is creating the marriage between God and the world. And marriage itself is the process where you can have a spark of infinity, give birth to children forever. So in other words, this concept of testifying and creating something by your testimony, not just revealing something that already exists, but bringing the essence of God into the world, the prime example for that is marriage. And that's why the halachic rule of marriage is that you have to have not just witnesses who testify, but not just witnesses who clarify, but witnesses who establish. So let's read it inside. This is the inner rationale why the witnesses of Kiddushin, of marriage, are Eidei Kiyum. They are witnesses who establish the ultimate goal of Kiddushin, the ultimate goal of marriage and of betrothal, and the marriage that follows it is that the couple be fruitful and multiply. Bringing children into the world reflects how God's infinite power is drawn down to this physical plane. Because like I said, you have a child, you may see him, just one child that will live for 120 years, but in that moment of birth, you have the potential for infinity, for children forever. So in other words, God's infinity is drawn down to this physical world through Kiddushin. So marriage is what brings about the ability, brings down the holiness of God. It brings down the power of God, of the infinity of God to have children forever. And the marriage and children result, okay? This is expressed also in the simple fact that the witnesses to Kiddushin are Eidei Kiyum. So I think we'll stop here because now we're going to get into the categories of sort of from here we get much more detailed and analytical, which maybe we can do another time. But for now, I think that this is already enough to think about. And just to summarize quickly what we did, we said heaven and earth. So first thing we say, when we say we are testifying to the essence of, testifying to the existence of God, we're not talking about testifying to the fact that God exists or creates the world or fills the world. That's memale, that's obvious. We're not even talking about testimony to the fact that God transcends the world, because that is also not obvious, but something that is likely to be revealed. Anyone with a head on their shoulders, like they used to say, you can deduce from this physical world and the life that creates it that there's something transcendent to that, because even the life of the world has to have a source. The essence of God is what is concealed, and the essence of God is what we testify to. Now, we're not the only testimony. We're not the only witnesses. We said the Zohar says there's two possibilities of how you want to read the verse in Isaiah. Either heaven and earth are the witnesses, or the human being is a witness. Okay, what's the difference? Heaven and earth are passive. Heaven and earth are witnesses who clarify. They tell you about the rays of infinity that God planted in this universe so that we should understand, and they should reveal the true infinity of God's essence. That's heaven and earth. That's the witnesses of heaven and earth. Then you have the Jew who says the Shema, who does a mitzvah. What is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is drawing the essence of God into this world. Now you are a witness, not just the witnesses who clarifies to what God already did, but you're responsible for the marriage. You're responsible for bringing the infinity of God into this world in a much deeper and more present way. So I think this is beautiful. And did I do this? We once did a course for JLI and for Chabad.org, and we did 4 lectures on the Rebbe's talks, and I think this was one of them, because I think this was one of them. Because I think I really liked it a lot. So I think this is very, very beautiful. Okay.